Hello, my name is Octavia Starbuck, and I'm the director of the Amherst County Museum and Historical Society. It is our pleasure to bring this program to you today called the Amherst County Cemeteries and Headstones by YouTube, since we are still unable to come together due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Our presenter today is Sandi Esposito, a local architectural historian and researcher in Amherst County. Sandi received a BA degree in historical preservation from Mary Washington College in 1991 and a master's in history from Liberty University in 2020. She currently is researching a number of historical places in Amherst County for recognition by the Virginia Department of Historic Resources and the National Park Service. Sandi is a volunteer at the Amherst Museum, and she serves on our activities committee. She is the lead researcher and lead guide of the museum's annual Ghost Walk event. She's also actively involved in her church and its youth program. Today's program is brought to you by the Amherst County Museum and Historical Society, the Amherst County Public Schools, and the Amherst Lancers Tech Club, with support from Amherst County, the Greater Lynchburg Community Foundation, and the Town of Amherst. We'd love to hear from you following the presentation. You can reach us through YouTube, our Facebook page, email, and by our website. So sit back and relax as Sandi Esposito enchants you with some Amherst cemetery and gravestone history. Thank you.
This is a presentation that was done last year at the museum, and we're representing it. There's a little more information in here because I have actually learned a little bit more since that, so I put that in there. This started I help Ellen Craig, who usually she's the cemetery guru, is the best way to put it, for the museum, and I help her. We go out and we document all sorts of different cemeteries and things. When you're out there in the cemetery, you need to kind of look at them. You kind of get an idea of their size, and you count usually depressions that you can see, headstones, and we photograph it, and we get an idea of who is buried there, if there are any etch markers. And a lot of times we bring it back and we start doing research because we want to bring this cemetery alive for people to understand that these were people and their contributions to the county. So that's a little bit about what's going on. And a lot of people have never really considered what cemetery, well, the different types of cemeteries. We have regular cemeteries, which you think of as the Amherst Cemetery, the Christian Aid Cemetery. These are products of the late 19th century. We have burial plots, which are or family graveyards, and these are located on plantations. Now, how these got started is because it was too far really to travel to the church for a burial, because that's where traditional burials took place. And you see some of that here in Amherst County. We have, for instance, there's St. Mark's and Clifford, and you can see where the burials come almost right up to the church building itself. There's St. Luke's out at Peddler Mills. Scott Zion on Galtsville Road is another place you see these type of cemeteries. So we have the traditional burial at the church. We have the family plots, which you tend to find in all sorts of places. And then we have regular cemeteries like the Amherst Cemetery. And we'll see a little bit of all of these in this presentation. Now, our traditions have, how do I want to say this? They have come over time, you find in the Bible there are traditions with burials, and you read about that, and then time has changed some of them just the way you need to. Most of our burial practices today are based on European practice, some of the African American traditions, and there is some Native American traditions as well. The Amherst County gets to have a little bit of everything, so we have all these things. Certain traditions that we have. In particular, if you walk into a cemetery, just kind of note how everybody's buried. If you kind of take your compass and look at it, you're going to notice that most people are buried, and this is true for African American traditions as well, where the feet are facing west and the feet are facing east and the head is facing west. And this particular tradition comes from the Bible. We'll talk about it a little bit in a second. But this is typical. Something else that you'll find that in some cemeteries, you'll find where people are located. If they are buried on the north or south side, they may have been more or less important. More northern burials are less important than the southern burials, or are usually later burials. Then you have those that are buried outside. If there's a fence around it, that could indicate they were slave. It could also indicate that that was a family member who was not in really good terms with the rest of the family. Also, you'll notice in some places, and you can't tell by looking at it, but ministers tend to be buried just the opposite way, with their head at the west and their head at the east and their feet at the west. Get that mixed up all the time. And that's so when Christ comes back, thing is that they can rise up and they are facing their sheep and they can shepherd their flock. And these are some things. If things that are unusual is there are upside down burials. That usually indicates either a suicide, or maybe somebody was practicing witchcraft, or they just were not really looked well upon by the family. And then there are also in Europe, there are what they call crossroads burials. And these are also people who were suicides or may have been not following the rules of society. And so they're buried outside the graveyard and at a crossroads, so that the rumor is that they could not find their way to the right place. So that's what you find out about some of those. In Amherst, we have the cemeteries, the family or farm cemeteries. They chose the land. Usually the land that was chosen was unsuitable for farming. And you can sometimes they're near the house and sometimes they're a good distance from the house. It depends on where the family decided to locate it. But usually it's a well-drained piece of land, but it's not suitable for farming. In particular, this one here, it's the Massey Family Cemetery. That sits on the side of a hill. And those buried upward on the hill are the family, and lower down on the hill is the slaves. But they combine both the family and the slaves. Churchyards, older churches is adjacent or near the building. Sometimes some do intrude on the yard, but sometimes they don't. And the cemetery is usually sometimes on the back of the church or over to the side. And of course, Amherst Cemetery and the Christian Aid are the oldest regular cemeteries, late 19th century cemeteries. This is Bethany Methodist Church, and you can see where the burial starts there and kind of goes around on the back on that. Going back to the traditions, and the head at the west and feet at the east, yes. This is the minister's face, but it's based on this particular Bible passage. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. So we're rising up to face Christ. And it's very interesting that African American burials even before they adopted Christianity, some of those are also buried in the same manner. So it's a tradition found everywhere. And of course, the upside down burials. Headstones and footstones. You find all sorts of things used. It could be based on economic situation, what is available locally, or the personal choice of the family. Generally, your marble, of course, you would think of as a much more prestigious family. We have, I'm trying to think here. Used in Amherst County, we have seen slate, granite, marble, fieldstones, quartz. Actually, other materials have been used. There's concrete and metal. So it varies depending on the situation or the personal choice of those that are being buried. Some places, especially like the African American ones, they're simply stones that are used. And there's nothing etched on the stone, there's nothing there, but the person who was buried, it was tended to be passed down by oral tradition who was buried there. And if you look in the way that some of the white versus the African American cemeteries are buried, in the white cemeteries, it tends to be a much orderly line, symmetrical presentation of the way the stones are. The African American, it's much more relaxed. The burials could be in all sorts of different places, and the stones tend to be that way as well. Now, a lot of the cemeteries that you'll come across, the family cemeteries, you'll notice that if you look along here and here, the walls, there are 4 walls. There's no gate. And the purpose for this is to protect the cemetery so that animals, all sorts of animals, including cattle and everybody, would not wander into that cemetery. So it's a means of protection. Now, this particular cemetery is the Dillard Cemetery. It's located on the Greif brothers' land. The burials in here, it's pretty interesting. You'll see one here where the tree is kind of growing up over top of the stone itself. And you can see the stones are in various states of uprightness because it just takes its toll. Time takes its toll on these. This particular graveyard is that of who's buried in there is a man named Teresha Dillard, and Teresha Dillard has a very interesting story associated with him. In 1863, he was out on what is called Pettagon Island in the James River. And he did not have a reputation of being a very nice man. And while he was out there, apparently he was by himself, and depending on what newspaper accounts you look at, 2 to 6 of his slaves grabbed him, they beat him to death, and he was buried on the island. Well, the family recovered his body and brought it up to the family graveyard, and here is his gravestone, that of Teresha Dillard. He was born in 1817 and died in 1863, just to give you an idea of his age. Just the idea of what happened, those slaves, they caught them and they were hung at Amherst Courthouse. But he was also brought and put into his family's graveyard. And if you look very carefully at the symbolism on the stone, that's another thing to look at when you're walking through any type of cemetery. Stone symbolism gives you an idea about the person, tells you something about them, something maybe about their life or what their interests were. Well, this one in particular features a Masonic emblem, the compass and square. So he was a member of the local Masonic society, and that was, at that point in time, leaders, men who were leaders, it was very important for them to be a member of this society. Today, it's not looked upon as important, but at that point in time it was. And there are other symbols within this cemetery. Here's the one, and this is the one that the tree is growing over. This is that of his wife. And if you look carefully at hers, it shows a calla lily. Well, the representation of a calla lily on a stone usually indicates beauty, marriage, or the resurrection. So, and some symbols can have different meanings. And you can see that these are in pretty poor condition. A follow-on program to this is how to clean some of these stones. And the reason you have to be very careful is you need to know what material you're working with, and you want to be as gentle as possible with it, because you never know how badly chemical things can affect both the writing, and you can see, this stuff has taken over a lot of the writing, or it will obscure things, or it will just really tear up the stone and cause further weathering of the stone. And then right here is another family member, and you can see a hand pointing up, and you can also see a rose that's in full blossom. Now, a full blossom rose indicates a full life, and the hand pointing up is indicating heaven, or that they're headed towards heaven. Some more stones in here you can see that are the rounded headstone, and this one features right here. It's a 3-leafed plant. It looks like what is known as a trillium, and of course this is indicative of the 3 parts of God: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And here there's another hand pointed up, and you can see this is a broken stone, but notice how detailed and well carved this particular stone is with its outline. So you find all sorts of things there. More stones. This one, old traditional type stone with the curve, what they call the tympanum here. And this one right here is that of William Dillard. And from what we have here, it's an open book. Now, the book can symbolize several different things. First, it can be the symbol of the Book of Life. His name is written in the Book of Life. The Bible itself could indicate he was a scholar of some type, or even that he was a minister. So all the different things that you can find on stones. And kind of changing what you look at, here is a cemetery, and of course you can see how it was orderly, but time has taken its toll on it. This is the Downey Cemetery up off Para Road. It's up in the National Forest. And there was a school nearby this cemetery, and we'll talk about that again in a second. But this family here, we found out, because we did some research on them, that they were stonemasons, because we noticed some very odd stones within that particular cemetery. Of course, you've got your traditional carved stone here with the name and date, and another one here, but you'll notice this is an unusual piece, and these here are unusual. Now, these that are carved, there's no etching of the name, dates, or anything on there. But the family was a bunch of masons, so they would have stones, scrap stone laying about. And apparently, what I asked a friend of mine, who does a lot with gravestones, and he says, well, this looks like fireplace surrounds. That these may have been used for a fireplace surround, or just were never used, and they used them as upright stones in the cemetery. So you have that, and this, a brick of some type, and I believe this was a footstone. So you have headstones and you have footstones. Sometimes there's only headstones. And the purpose for these, which some people kind of wonder about, is here's a memorial of who is buried there, but it's also part of the superstition in that they couldn't rise from the grave. They would stay in. Now this is the White family cemetery. It's also in that same area, closer towards the town of Amherst on Para Road. Now this family, the Whites, because it's mostly white, the family White buried there, they are related to those in the Downey Cemetery. We kind of got into a little bit. These are also people that are related to, and we'll see his burial in a minute, Oddie Klein Powell. And he's a famous little boy here in Amherst. So his story is pretty interesting. In this cemetery, you find some handmade stones. You can tell this is hand carved. Here again, another piece of, we don't know, could have been a fireplace surround, could have been something that they found. It was a scrap of some type. I'm not sure what it is, but that was used for burial. Again, you see, here's another very crudely carved stone, and here's some nice ones. Right here, Emma Watts, you'll notice that she has an urn with flowers. Well, an urn is usually an indication of mourning, and it's perhaps that she liked flowers and they put the flowers in it, but that's another symbol. And you see some are just simple with the name and date on them. Now, this is a cemetery that has an interesting story to it as well. This is an African American cemetery, and this was the condition we first saw it. It has since been cleaned up. There's a fence around it, and the cemetery preserved as best as possible. We were looking through it, and you were finding all sorts of stones. We started looking up some of the people, and they were indeed African Americans. There was possibly an African American settlement near the training school, which is the Central Virginia Training School, now closed. But this settlement, we don't know a whole lot about it. We're still kind of looking into it to find out as much information as possible. But it existed on the site before the school was built. And the cemetery was preserved in a sense. They knew where it was, but nobody had really done anything to it, and it was allowed to get overgrown and just in terrible condition. The stones that you see in this one are, again, very soft stones, so some of them have not weathered well, and kind of make our bits and pieces of names and people that are in there. We did find one very nice stone put into the cemetery, and again, now you can see them more. I think there were something like 30 or so burials in this particular cemetery once they cleaned it up. It's a very interesting one, and it's now going to be preserved right there on the site, so this community will not be forgotten. The training school also has a cemetery themselves, and you see a lot of you see some upright stones, but mostly they're all ground stones. And it's a very orderly cemetery. The way they're kind of buried here kind of reminds me of the way the Moravians bury. Moravian cemeteries are very interesting because where a lot of times people bury according to their family or in groups of burials, the Moravian cemetery is divided into married men, married women, single men, single women, and you're buried according to your status. And you're also buried, you never know who you're going to be buried to, but buried next to, because you're buried the day you died is the way the burials go. So you can follow who's dying when and how many people died on what day. So it's just one right after the other. This is kind of like that, where, you know, when you died, the year you died, that's where you're buried next to. Two very interesting stones that are there at the training school is this one. Mr. McCracken was a Civil War vet, and he came to the training center. They never knew much about him. And if you look at his stone, it's got clasped hands. This is indicating being greeted into heaven. Now, sometimes there's one with a man and wife, and usually you can tell the female versus the male hand, and that's which of the spouses died first is the one greeting the other one into heaven. So there's several different ways that this is presented, but his has that. And then here's Emma Buck, and I went and found her in particular because I know a little bit about her backstory. She was the mother of Carrie Buck, and there's a Supreme Court decision on the Buck versus Bell, and it's on sterilization in the United States. It was the model court case for that particular thing during the era of eugenics. The particular case has never been repealed, though we do not practice the sterilization any longer. But this is a very interesting thing that this all happened here in Amherst County, and that was a very noted case at the time, approximately 1921, I believe. And then we go back to Para Road, and I want to mention Oddie Klein Powell. This is a little man. He was, as you can see by his dates here, he was not but 4 years old. He was in school, and the schoolhouse was near the Downey Cemetery up at Para Road. He was sent out with a lot of the other boys, even though he was one of the youngest. He was sent out and they were to go find firewood. Well, apparently he wandered off and was never found. Now, he was eventually found 4 months later when a hunter found his little body up off the parkway on Bluff Mountain. But the family, they were just distraught. This was, they had sent out many people to look for him, and they just could not find him, and they couldn't believe how far he'd wandered. This is several miles from the school. His mom and his dad had him buried near their house. That's why he's not in any other cemetery. This is his own little cemetery. And the reason for that is so his mom could keep an eye on him. And because this affected her so much, she died about a year later because she was just heartbroken over this accident. There's also a stone for Oddie Klein Powell right here. That's up on Bluff Mountain. And many hikers leave little knickknacks and all in remembrance of Oddie. This is a very fun cemetery. You'll notice here, this one is one of the best preserved. You don't really have to do much upkeep here, because what happened was they took the stones up out of the ground, and you can see here some field stones here and some edge stones. They poured concrete within the area. It was a brick fence around it, and then replaced all the stones. And then there's a solid fence. This wrought iron fence surrounds the cemetery, so you have to kind of climb over the fence to get into it. Again, it's protected, but Somebody mentioned sometime, well, you wouldn't have to worry about the zombies coming up from that because they couldn't get through that block of cement. But I was really shocked when I saw this the first time I came upon it. We were doing some survey, and it just took me a while to take in the full effect of a concrete cemetery. So they don't have to mow the grass, but it is well preserved, and nobody's going to bother this one. Now I'll show you in a series here of some of the cemeteries all over the county. Here is a simple fieldstone markers that are up on Banton Lane. We don't know the family this belonged to. We don't know anything about it. We've done some research on the deeds of the people who live there, but we're still really uncertain as to who these belong to. Here is Brightwell's Mill Cemetery, and this milling family. This is right up above where Brightwell's Mill is, and it's kind of hidden. This one is the Christian Cemetery. The Christian family lived near Stapleton, and they have a very famous member of their family. This particular stone right here is that of Charles Burks Christian. To say this man was a character is kind of an understatement. He was born in 1834 and died in 1916. Charles Burks Christian is notorious, to say the very least. He was a man who, when he was very young, he was in school over at Lexington, and because of the typical controversy surrounding women, he ended up, the murder of a VMI cadet took place. Apparently he stabbed him. Now, he was acquitted of this because they believed that it was in self-defense. We don't know all the full story of this, but it was a case. It was very well known throughout Virginia at the time, the case of the young law student versus the VMI cadet. Also, he went on to join the Confederacy in the Civil War, and he became an officer, and he was captured at Cold Harbor. Well, he became what was known as part of the Immortal 600. The Immortal 600 were a group of officers who were taken. He was wounded at Cold Harbor, so he was recovering, but he was taken down to South Carolina, and all these officers were put as human shields against the Confederacy. They were bombing a particular fort in South Carolina. And again, this is a whole controversial affair. They were moved. Eventually he was sent to Fort Delaware, up in Delaware, where he served out the rest of the time of the war. And he and many of the other officers, their fortitude they could have been easily forgiven and sent home had they taken an oath of allegiance. They would not do it until after the war did they take an oath of allegiance. Once they were released, they were just basically given a ticket home. So he came home. He practiced law in Amherst County for a while. He was Commonwealth's attorney. He lost an election and wasn't real happy with that. And he challenged the man who won, challenged him to a duel. Thank goodness that was broken up. And he was also known for antics within the courtroom, brawling and things of that sort. And he was a friend of Judge Campbell's. Judge Campbell, also a notorious man. He's the one who whipped the minister on the courthouse stairs. And Charles Burks Christian
was his attorney for that case here in Amherst County. So, man lived a pretty interesting life. Right here we have the El Bethel Cemetery, and these are some modern stones here. This particular cemetery, though it sits behind El Bethel Methodist Church, it was not part of the church. The cemetery was given by William Parr, who is also a Civil War veteran, because he wanted the community to have a cemetery. So this cemetery is still being used today, and you can see how some of the modern stones, the granite and all, is carved, and the colors and things put in there for these stones. William Parr has an interesting grave in this cemetery. His contains a what we usually consider the Confederate flag on it, and he is also honored within the church. He was part of Bethel Methodist Church. Now you see all sorts of different designs and things throughout Amherst. Here's one that's at Forks of Buffalo, and you can see palm trees on this one. And the palms indicate the resurrection, the eternal life. You have this one here. This is Drummond Cemetery, and there are only 2 stones in that. That's behind a small wall. This one is found up off of 60 West. It's very, very small. And you can see a willow tree, the willow, a sign of mourning. It's very popular in the late 19th century, used on graves. Here are 2 more interesting stones. This one here for Samuel Meredith Garland and his wife. This is at Kenmore. If you look, it's kind of a scroll or a tablet. In a sense, their name is written in the Book of Life. Here is another one. This is the Lavender Cemetery. And you notice there are gates and then the clasped hands right here. Well, the gates, of course, are indicative of heaven, and of course, the clasped hands being welcomed into heaven. So you find different variations of some of the same things throughout. These are the Leftwich Cemetery, which is up in the Temperance area of Amherst. And this is an African American cemetery, and you can see where they have made this particular stone is of concrete, and they put a heart in it. And the heart, of course, indicating love for this particular person. And then on this stone here, which is a regular carved stone, we've got the person's picture, and they've got an elephant. And the elephant, maybe just her favorite animal, we don't know. But, and of course, always with his trunk up indicates good luck. But these are just some of the things that you see. The crown and cross, these are also really popular types of stones. This one in the Massey Cemetery, and the Massey Cemetery has an interesting story associated with it. When we were documenting it, we came across some grave that the stone looked like it was missing. We're like, oh, okay, missing stone. And the owner goes, no, there's a story to that. This person wasn't well liked by his slaves, and they stole the stone so that he couldn't be found. And this is Mary White, and she's in the White Cemetery, and you can see cross and crown, resurrection, Christian symbols. This is another one of those very old cemeteries with the rock wall around it. You have to really know where you're looking, because this one kind of blends in with the background. But this is a Parr Cemetery, and you can see William Parr, the founder of the Parr family, and his wife buried there. All sorts of burials, and you have to step over and into the cemetery. They have steps created in the wall for you to step into it. This is Peyton Keith Cemetery. This is near New Glasgow. And of course they have a wrought iron fence around it, and you can see there are some upright stones. They're in the middle of preserving this one. It had gotten into very bad shape. And this particular stone right here is this one here, and you'll notice a lamb on it. That lamb indicates that there was a child buried there. Now, of course, we kind of have to wonder about this particular person here, because they're buried right outside, and that's their stone. Very rough, handmade stone, put it down. But we don't know whether this indicates they were a slave, or whether or not they were a member of the family. We can't find any information on them. This cemetery is up at Ware's Gap. And it too was in the process of being restored. And you can see these are a lot of later 19th century stones here. You see it's called a pedestal with an urn on top of it, and the urn is always indication of mourning. This one here looks like a partial stump, or it may have been an actual stump, because this one was in terrible shape. We tripped over all sorts of things going in here. But usually there is a symbolism of a stump or a broken tree, and that's of life that has been broken. And then obelisks are also very popular symbols used for many cemeteries. And one of the flagstones on there, you'll see this has very interesting symbolism. There's a tombstone, a willow tree, and a bed. And from best I could find out, of course, the tombstone indicating death, the willow indicating mourning, and the bed apparently means rest in peace, but we're not sure. I have not found any information on that particular symbol being used or very popular at all. In St. Luke's Cemetery at Peddler Mills, there's one particular stone you can walk by. You want to knock on that stone because it's actually made of metal. The metal stone, this is of Louisa Ray, was put up, and of course you see a flower and around this circle of life is what's indicated by that. But this is a very interesting stone, and again, you wouldn't know it was metal unless you actually knocked on it. We got to visit one of the earlier home sites of some of the Monacan people, and this is up on Bear Mountain. And you can see some of the very different stones, some that were carved, some that were hand done, and some that a little bit of both. You can kind of see what's going on here. But that was up on Bear Mountain. But there were also, going up there, we thought we may have seen what are known as burial mounds, which are traditional ways of burying for the Native Americans. We're not sure, but these were pretty regular the way that we found these mounds going up side the mountain. So we're not sure, but that's a traditional Native American way of burying. There is another Native American cemetery that's located in Amherst County. It's well hidden off of Early Farm Road, and that's the Penn Cemetery. Now, in a post that was on the Amherst County Museum posts that were done last year during the summer, there's extensive pictures and things of the Penn Cemetery. And these are what are known as the Buffalo Ridge Indians. And that cemetery, we had that documented. We had it documented for Virginia Department of Historic Resources so that it will be preserved and nobody will disturb it. It had at least maybe nearing 100 burials there, all sorts of various stones, some soapstone, all sorts of different things there. It's a very neat place. It's very remote. and you have to know where you're going to find it. But that, and the one person who knows a whole lot about that is Dr. Forrest Rice.
That's his particular family cemetery. Now, here's an interesting place, and this is part of some of the new information I've learned. This is Scott Zion Church on Galt's Mill Road. Now, the church here, this dates from 1942. The original church was located in this area just beyond the edge of the photo here. And this is the earliest part of the cemetery. Now, you're seeing a lot of things missing. And that's because some of the stones were washed away. There may never have been stones there. And you can see it's kind of a haphazard type burial, but it goes right up to the side of the newer church. You also see various plantings. If you look in these plantings, there are some stones within those, and they're very hard to get to because the plantings have so overgrown them. These are some of the earliest members of the church, dating to post-Civil War. Here's one of the early stones. You can see it was handmade as well. And there are many handmade ones in this area, and just things that are lost. But yucca plants, or my mom refers to them as rock lilies, these were all traditional plants used in cemeteries. There's some periwinkle, another traditional planting. There are also things such as all sorts of flowers and trees and bushes planted on some of the graves, and this is very traditional of African American burials, believing that this is good for the person who's buried. They are remembered and they're coming back to life through these plants. But this is the oldest section. There's more here, and it goes to the other side and it goes down. There's approximately 500 burials here, and they're still burying in this. You see many of their traditions are continued. You see here's a cross, and then here's some other stones that are found. And looking down through here, that's the newer part of the cemetery. One of the newer graves I noticed when I was there taking pictures, they had planted tulips on it, live tulips on the grave. There's another grave that you can see it in this picture right here. They've planted a maple tree, and again, these stones and things, you can see how they made a lot of their own stones, their own designs, or were hand done. So this cemetery has got a lot of history to it, a lot of very interesting stones. One stone in particular I was noticing, and that of a military stone, and it was the 300th Barrage Balloon Battalion. I had no idea about this, and came back and was looking it up. This was a group of the only African Americans who were on the beach, Omaha Beach, during D-Day, and their purpose was to put up barrage balloons, and those were to prevent the men who were landing on the beach from being strafed by enemy airplane. So, had no idea we had that kind of notorious people here. And we have other memorials all throughout. Here's the Confederate Memorial that's at the courthouse. These are memorials here to, it's World War I, World War II, Korea and Vietnam, I believe. So these are all memorials for men who have died during that, so that they are not forgotten. And we'll end in the Amherst Cemetery. This is, if you ever want to take a walk and just walk through this cemetery, it's very interesting. There's so many things to see. Of course, you see right here a typical obelisk on a pedestal, and you'll see how each of the families, kind of some of them delineate themselves with the palings that are around. There are some field stones there, just a very simple burials. And other stones you see, here's one here with the Confederate veteran emblem on it. This one here with a sheaf of wheat. And we have some of the more modern ones are very interesting. Here's one with a church on it. And the right in my father's house are many mansions. And here's one with a Bible on it. Don't know much about the person buried there. I had a little trouble kind of reading it, but the Bible, of course, indicative of many different things. Could have been a minister, and it could have been just simple personal preference. Also, you see here's a Celtic cross, and the circle within that is supposed to indicate eternity. Here looks like figures of Joseph and Mary. Here's this is a very great late 19th century, because mourning practices became very important during that time. And you have the sepulchre type burial with this woman figure, and she's holding an urn. All of that indicating, and the laurel as well, indicating life afterwards, and then the mourning of the family. Other stones that you see, of course, you can kind of see more of the palings here delineating the family. Here's another lamb, a little child. This one right here, this double tablet, probably a husband and wife. Also the tablet indicating the Bible. Here's more with palm leaves and the pedestal and urn. Here's another one with a rose, and you can tell it's a very young person from the stage. The rose is just opening, so very short life. Here's a cross, and you can see that stones by the late 19th century have become very elaborate. Also very traditional to go out and spend time with your loved ones. Here's a bench that was put out, and you could go out. Some people actually went out and they would have like Sunday lunches out in the cemetery. And it's just a traditional way to remember those who have passed on. This one's a real interesting one here. You can kind of see different buildings. It looks a little Moorish. It looks like it's indicative of Jerusalem. And again, this one, in my father's house are many mansions. So I think this is indicating heaven and that their place in heaven. Here's a broken column, also indicating a short life, broken life, and more of the pedestals with the urns and different types, and you see how they all vary. And just taking a walk through the cemetery can be very interesting, and you can learn a whole lot. What we're doing with some of the newer cemeteries that we find is we try to give you what the life was between the dash. What the dash indicates gives you an idea of how they lived, and that's what we're trying to do with some of the newer cemeteries and all that we're finding. Just try to find some information on the people in them. Thank you very much.